Recently, the Frontier Center for Public Policy released a major landmark study on public transit. The question is public transit serving you?
A clear path forward requires looking back and learning. Good public policy requires human connection. It's a consideration of the facts, applying common sense and innovation. It's urban, it's rural, it's real life. We all have something to contribute. We all have a responsibility to get informed because there's a little piece of Canada in all of us, isn't there? Let's learn on this path together. This is Leaders on the Frontier.
A recent report tabled by the Frontier Center for Public Policy has to do with public transit, specifically rail transit. And here with me to talk about this landmark report is the author, Randal O'Toole. Randal O'Toole's a president of the Thoreau Institute, and he is joining with us today to discuss this report. Welcome, Randal.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Well, Randal, it's a very interesting report that you prepared. It's fascinating because you really took a deep dive into examining the transit systems, their costs, their efficiency or efficacy to serve the commuting public. And I think you came up with some fascinating insights into 8 communities across Canada. What was the key insight that you take away from that report?
Well, the politicians who are promoting rail transit and the transit agencies who are promoting rail transit have an archaic view of what cities are like, and they have an archaic view of transportation technologies. Rails are great for moving lots of volume from point A to point B, but when you've got people who are spread out over large urban areas, rails are a very poor way of moving people around. They might have worked 120 years ago when most jobs were downtown. Most jobs were in factories, most factories were downtown, and most people lived in high-density residential areas around the downtowns. And so streetcars and other rail transit moved people from the dense residential areas to the downtown jobs. Today, only about 10% of jobs are in downtown areas. 90% are somewhere else. And rails don't work very well at moving people to other places other than downtown. Well, the transit agencies that are building rail transit are relying on this archaic view of what a city is like, and then relying on an archaic technology that doesn't make sense in modern cities.
Well, I found the report to be really quite an eye-opener because certainly you examine these 8 communities, and in Canada, we're spending billions of dollars on rail transit systems, and I'm sure people mean well. Of course they do. We need good transit in our communities, but you really laid it open that it's really an outmoded dinosaur, if you will, a model that's really not going to relate to how cities work currently. So I think for me, that was a real revelation. So you're saying essentially that most people don't live in the center downtown anymore, and yet you're dropping all these railway lines into the downtowns. Is that essentially what you're saying? They're misaligned.
Yes, just as an example, more than 45% of the people who work in downtown Calgary take transit to work. Transit works for people who work in downtown Calgary. But
Right.
only less than 10% of the people who work anywhere else in the Calgary urban area take transit to work. Transit doesn't work for you if you don't work downtown. And guess what? Less than 10% of workers in the Calgary urban area work downtown. And so you've got a transit system that's designed to help less than 10% of people get to work. The other 90% are helping to pay for it, but it doesn't serve them.
Gosh, it sounds so unfair. So I'd really encourage people to read the report. You can find it on the Frontier Center website. And it's certainly features one of those iconic rail commuting systems. And they are expensive, are they not, Randal? Like we're not talking just a few $1 million. We're talking really hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions, to do these kinds of projects. Is that right?
That's right. You know, it's possible to build a 4-lane freeway for about $50 million a mile or less. That's for 4 lanes, and each lane of that freeway will be able to move more people and a lot more freight than a single rail transit line can do. And yet they're spending, cities like Vancouver and Calgary and Edmonton and Toronto and Montreal are spending hundreds of millions of dollars a mile. In one case, over $1 billion a mile on rail transit lines. And these rail transit lines, aren't going to move very many people per mile. As I say, they're not going to move as many people as a single freeway lane, much less a whole freeway.
Exactly. So let's make our way through some of the highlights of the report. First of all, what were the 8 communities that you examined across the country? What were the ones that you looked at? Because obviously you couldn't examine everyone, but you looked at major Canadian cities. Which ones were they?
Well, I looked at all the cities, and incidentally, if people haven't figured it out, I'm from the United States, and so I just talked about dollars per mile. All of those dollars were really per kilometer, and they're Canadian dollars. As I say, one line is costing more than $1 billion a kilometer, which would be $1.6 billion per mile for those who are counting. Now, I looked at 8 urban areas that either are building or are planning rail transit. That includes Edmonton, the first urban area in Canada to have light rail, and Calgary, the second, Hamilton, Kitchener, which is really Kitchener Waterloo. Waterloo built a light rail line, and Montreal, Ottawa, and Toronto, which was the first city to have a subway line. And finally, Vancouver, which has what they call a sky train, which is kind of midway between light rail and subway.
Exactly. So if we look at some of the key findings of the report, we do have some graphs here we did want to share. One of which is looking at the first graph, which is about I believe it's transit speed, which kind of illustrates the difference between rail and other options such as buses. Is that a good illustration here, Randall?
Well, people look at rail and they think that rail is going to be fast. You know, you think of high speed trains and things like that, when actually rail isn't necessarily that fast at all. You can run buses that are running at, say, what's called bus rapid transit. They have limited number of stops compared with the regular buses. They might stop only once a mile. And buses like that can easily run 50 kilometers an hour, whereas the fastest light rail is only on average running about 25 or 26 kilometers an hour. Subways, elevateds, which together are called heavy rail, might run at a little over 30 kilometers an hour. But there are exclusive busways that are much faster. If you have commuter buses that start in a suburban community and board passengers and then run straight downtown or straight to some other employment center, they might be going 40, 50, 60 kilometers an hour on average or more. So really, the only thing that holds up buses is the roads that they're on, whereas rail lines have a lot of things holding them up. If they cross existing traffic, that slows them down. And if they have to stop frequently, that slows them down, and so on and so forth. Rails are not necessarily faster than buses, and they're often much slower.
Though I think this graph illustrates that point that you have with a rail transit option, really a much slower one compared to these other options. And that means that you don't carry as many people as quickly. I mean, not to point out the obvious, but that's the point that you're making, is it not, Randall?
That's right. And speed is important because you're competing not against buses, you're competing against automobiles. And
Is
if
it?
people can get around in an automobile at, 50, 60 kilometers an hour on expressways, they're not going to be too happy with going on a light rail or some other rail line that's only going at 25 or 30 kilometers an hour.
That's it. Exactly. Now, another interesting graph in the report had to do with an illustration of the share of transit workers with different commuting options. And I thought that was well illustrated that, again, the share of rail is quite low. Is that right?
Well, this shows total transit, rail and bus. And the interesting thing about this is that, as I said, transit mainly serves downtown. And what
I,
happened with the pandemic was that a lot of downtown workers ended up working at home. And some of them are back to work downtown now, but a lot of them are still working at home. And what's happened is that if you were a transit commuter, you are much likely to be more likely to be working at home today than if you were an automobile commuter. So transit was especially hit hard by the pandemic. So we see just in one case in Montreal, about almost 24% of commuters were taking transit to work before the pandemic, and today it's about 9%, or at
wow,
least after
what a
the
decrease.
pandemic.
Amazing.
And so, and this has been essentially the pandemic accelerated a trend that was already in place. It's already, as I mentioned, we went from most jobs being downtown 100 years ago to
If it,
90%, 80 to 90% of jobs being outside of downtown today or before the pandemic. The transit simply, the pandemic simply accelerated that trend. And since transit agencies in Canada have oriented their systems around downtown so much, they are the big losers. And we're not going to get a lot of those people back onto transit.
exactly. Uh, so then the other graph that we wanted to share with our audience had to do with, well, what does this mean when we look at transit kilometers per hour?
Well, we're talking about transit capacities, and we think, a light rail train might be able to hold 600 people, and a heavy rail train, a subway or an elevated train, might be able to hold 1,000 people. And so we think they're high capacity transit.
So it's
But
been
there's one problem. For safety reasons, you can't run light rail trains more than about once every 3 minutes, or about 20 an hour. The most frequent Toronto subways are about 28 per hour, 28 trains an hour. So you multiply the number of people potentially on a train by the number of trains per hour, and you get for light rail about 20,000 people an hour. For
said.
Toronto subways, about 36,000 people an hour. Some of Vancouver's sky trains are about 15,000 people an hour, and others are 25,000 people an hour. Well, it turns out for every single class of rail transit, we can find a busway somewhere in the world that's capable of moving far more people per hour. Portland, Oregon
Wow.
has a busway that can move 22,000 people per hour, far more than any light rail line. Istanbul, Turkey has a busway that moves 30,000 people an hour, far more than the Vancouver SkyTrain.
That's
And
it.
Bogota, Colombia has a busway that can move 45,000 people an hour, far more than a Toronto subway. So these
Okay.
busways have the advantage in that they're cheap to build and the vehicles are cheap to buy compared to rail transit.
Wow. So that's kind of the punchline then of the report, isn't it? That on comparison after comparison, certainly with bus as a transit option, rail doesn't really meet the ability to bring people across different aspects around the city where so many people don't work in the downtown anymore. But based on speed and capacity and even flexibility, why do we keep putting in all these expensive rail transit systems, Randall?
Well, the answer is actually pretty simple, but to understand it, let's go back to the 1950s when most transit systems were still privately owned. And it was accepted within the transit industry that buses were better than rails. In 1927, a company developed a bus that was cheaper to buy and cheaper to operate than any rail system. And so from then on, transit agencies, transit companies stopped building rail and they started replacing existing rail lines with buses. So by the 1950s, it was accepted in the industry. Rails were out, buses were in. But then government started taking over transit systems all over Canada, all over the United States, all over the world, really. And here's the thing about government. Government isn't interested in efficiency. Government is interested in political saleability. And if you're a politician, then if something costs more, that's a benefit to you because number one, you have dollars to spread around, and some of those dollars will come back to you in the form of campaign contributions.
But
Number two, if a project costs more, it's probably going to employ more people. So you can say you're putting more people to work and giving more people jobs than if you have a project that costs
fascinating.
less. So for the politicians, the benefit of rail transit is its high cost. And taxpayers have to pay for it. They're going to have to pay for it forever until we finally decide to tear them out. But the politicians benefit from it. And so they end up supporting rail transit and then telling people, oh, we're going to relieve congestion, or oh, we're helping poor people, or oh,
Interesting.
we're reducing greenhouse gas emissions, none of which are probably true. But that's what they say in
Wow.
order to justify these projects.
Okay, so, but that kind of analysis, Randall, I think would be a shock for a lot of Canadians. They would kind of assume that, well, the government decision makers, they sit down and much as we've gone through kind of on a summary level, done the option analysis, look at the capacity, the speed, the kind of costs and the flexibility, the needs of where people are wanting to commute, where they're going. It sounds like that's not as important as it is to lead with big dollars, with big benefits, and the perception is that somehow rail is better. Is that kind of, am I getting it?
Well, I was looking at an alternatives analysis recently, and it compared a rapid bus system with a light rail system. And the rail, they both were the same length. It was the same over the same route. And they found
Right.
that the rail system cost 3 times as much, but it would carry, or they thought it would attract about 50% more passengers. And so they decided to build rail because it would attract more passengers. And I said, wait a minute, what if you, instead of building one rapid bus line, you built 3 rapid bus lines for the same price or maybe a little less than the
Right.
rail line? And then you'd attract twice as many passengers as the rail line. But I think
That-
they deliberately distorted the analysis to make it look like rail was better because it would attract a few more riders. And, what the agencies do is they'll hire consultants to do the alternatives analysis. And the consultants know that if they select buses, they're not going to need any more consultants. You just buy buses and you run them. But if they select
Well,
rail, you need to hire consultants to do the design and engineering work because rails must be much more precisely built at a much higher cost than bus lines. And so
okay.
the consultants knew they were likely to be hired if they picked rail. So they deliberately biased the analysis to make it look like rail was better.
Wow. Okay, so I take your point that there's a lot of interested groups, coalitions of parties who really want to see um, expensive rail transit go forward. But part of this is there another argument to be made that somehow transit systems on rail are more environmentally friendly and better than buses or serve the public better?
Well, you can have electric buses or you can have electric trains, and they're both about equally efficient per seat mile. Buses might
Per
even be a little
kilometer,
more
Randall.
efficient. Seat kilometer, well, it's equally true for seat kilometers. But if you run buses, you can run them on existing kilometers of roads. If you decide to build trains, you have to build the trains from scratch. And the concrete required for the ties, the steel required for the rails, and all the energy going into it generates huge amounts of greenhouse gases. And it's quite possible that you're never going to carry enough passengers, even if carrying passengers saves some greenhouse gases, you'll never carry enough to pay that initial cost. And so those people who consider themselves environmentalists who are supporting rail transit are failing to consider the total life cycle cost of rail transit. And by failing to do that, they're actually endorsing the big corporations that want to profit from taxpayer largesse and not helping the environment at all.
Interesting. So, what about the argument that somehow rail lines are better for, like, is it fair to people that are on the low income of this of our society, people who are poor?
Well, it's always amusing when you hear that argument, and yet at the same time they'll say, but we have to build rail because middle class people won't ride a bus. So we have to have fancy trains for them to ride.
Oh,
And, if you look at the data, it turns out it's true that the income of rail passengers tended to be higher than the income of bus passengers before the pandemic. And then the high income people ended up working at home after the pandemic. And so now the rail lines are running emptier than the buses. They're recovering
doesn't it?
slower than the buses because the passengers tended to be the high income people who are more likely to work at home. So
Just
when you build rail, you're saying, okay, well, let's say a certain percentage of our transit riders are low income people, but what percentage of low income people are relying on transit to get to work? It's probably
just
around 5 to 10%, maybe 15%. So let's say it's 10%. The other 90% are having to pay the usually regressive taxes to support the rail transit systems,
that's it.
even though they're driving to work or they're walking or they're getting to work some way other than transit. So you've actually hurt low income people more than you've helped them because you've chosen to use regressive taxes to build a system that isn't going to be used by the vast majority of low income people.
Yeah. So, gosh, it's like every count you make, um, when you look at rail, it seems like on every count, it's really not competitive with flexible modern bus transit options. Is that the bottom line, Randall?
That's the bottom line. And, buses are so flexible. Here's the thing. Let's say you've got a route that could attract 100 people an hour. Well, then you can run like 2 buses or 4 buses an hour. Let's say you've got a route that could attract 1,000 people an hour. Then you run, 10 or 20 buses an hour. Let's say you've got a route that could attract 10 or 20,000 people an hour. Well, then you can have a lot more buses an hour, like 50 or 100 buses an hour. And let's say you've got a route that could attract 50,000 people an hour. Well, then at that point, you can have a lane that's dedicated exclusively to buses that has no cars on it, and you can run 500, 600 buses an hour or
Exactly.
more. And the cost per rider is about the same at all of these levels. We say that's scalable. Whereas with rail, you have to start out with this huge upfront cost, hundreds of
Yeah.
millions or billions of dollars. And if you don't get the ridership, the cost per rider is really high. And if you get a lot of riders, then you're stuck with this low capacity system like a light rail line or a medium capacity system like the Vancouver SkyTrain, and you don't have the capacity to handle more riders. In fact, I think
Exactly.
politically, one of the advantages of light rail is that it is such a low capacity system that it can look like it's being used and is a great success because the trains are full during some rush hours, when actually it's a failure because they selected a low capacity system when they actually had a demand that was higher than that.
So, can you repeat that again? So, you're saying that in some respects, the rail systems actually look successful, but it's only because they're already low capacity anyway, so they look full.
Yes, and it's an amusing thing. The term light rail, we think it means lightweight, but actually light rail cars weigh more than heavy rail cars, and they actually use the same weight of rails. The
That's
light
it.
in light rail doesn't refer to weight, it refers to capacity. The
Indeed.
definition of light rail transit is low capacity transit. And so
Interesting.
we
Yes.
build these low capacity transit systems at an enormous cost. They look full, so we claim it to be a great success, but really it was a failure because we built a low capacity system when we could have had a
That's it.
much higher capacity system for a much lower cost if we'd relied on buses instead of rail.
Exactly. Well, one of the things that was fascinating as well about your report is that you do get into really stunning examples where on the capital side, the initial upfront costs of these transit systems, they're typically over budget. Why is that?
Well, there's two possibilities. One is that the people who plan the systems accidentally were guilty of what's called optimism bias. Like if you say, okay, how much is it going to cost to build this particular kilometer of rail? Well, let's say it's going to cost $50 million, and it turns out it costs $75 million. So you're
Yeah.
optimistic about all these things, and the optimisms add up. What's it going to cost for concrete? What's it going to cost for steel
Sure.
rails? You have to make a lot of decisions like that. And if you're just optimistic about all of them, they just add up. The second reason why this happens is because the people who plan the systems are deliberately guilty of optimism bias. In other words,
Whatever.
they lowball their estimates deliberately so they can make them more politically appealing. And then after they get buy-in, after the politicians agree to build it and maybe even have broken ground, then they say, oops, turns out it's going to cost 78% more or 109% more, but
Did
you wouldn't want to let the money you spent go to waste, would you? You have to come up
it.
with the extra money to build it. So that's, you can look at each individual one and say, well, this one seems to be an accidental optimism bias. This one seems to be deliberate. Either
Right.
way, it's optimism bias.
And so we just talked about capital costs. What about operating costs, the ongoing annual costs? Because I notice there's a lot of systems around, like from SkyTrain to the ones in Ottawa and everywhere in between Montreal, where there's a lot of breakdowns. I mean, these systems, rail systems, take a lot of maintenance. Is that expensive?
It starts out being very cheap because you've got brand new rails, you've got brand new stations, you've got brand new signaling systems. And then what happens is over time, things start to break down and you need to start doing a lot more routine maintenance. And this is another political problem. Politicians, as one transportation planner told me, prefer ribbons, not brooms. In other words, they like to be at ribbon cutting ceremonies for the opening or the groundbreaking of a new project, but they don't want to pay for the maintenance of it because they don't get their names in the paper for paying for
That's it.
maintenance. And so you end up with huge maintenance backlogs. Rail lines tend to wear out after about 30 years. And if you don't
Darn.
replace the rails, the ties, the signaling systems, the electrical systems, you're going to start having serious problems. You're going to start having derailments. You're going to have fires. You're going to have smoke. You're going to have all kinds of problems that you weren't having for the first 10 years. And it's going to cost a lot of money to fix these deteriorated systems, almost as much as it costs to build them in the first place.
And when those systems are down, they're not carrying passengers, are they, Randall?
That's right. And so what I tell people is that when you want to expand transit, rely on buses. If you've already got rails, keep the rails until they wear out and then replace them with buses as soon as they wear out. I don't care if it's a Toronto subway or the Vancouver SkyTrain or the Edmonton light rail, replace them with buses as soon as they're wearing out. Don't spend a lot of money on rehabilitation as they wear out.
Okay, so that's very key advice. What I'm fascinated, though, is in the area of public policy as people make uh, public choices, in terms of the spending of taxpayers' money on the building of different transit options, that there isn't larger voices. Like it's, like there's not just the taxpayer that should be concerned about this, because this is spending billions of dollars in arguably ways that are really not serving the commuter as well as, say, other options like buses, as you've outlined so well. But it's also, interestingly enough, say the bus industry. Where is the bus industry here? Surely they would want to lobby more publicly and say, you know what, nothing against the rail systems, but they're not as flexible, nor do they carry as many passengers, and we're like half price.
Well, it's a funny thing. If you build a rail line, you think, well, the rail is going to replace buses, but the rail only serves a very narrow corridor. So to build up ridership, they end up buying a lot more buses to feed passengers into the rail lines. So you should end up having more buses operating more kilometers, more hours a day
Okay.
after you open the rail line than you did before. Unfortunately, that doesn't always happen. In a lot of cases, they'll build a rail line and they'll go over budget, so they'll cut the bus service. But in a lot of cases, they'll buy more buses. And so the bus manufacturing industry isn't necessarily hurt by rails. The same really is true for the auto industry, because in most cases, when you build rails, it doesn't convince that many people to junk their cars and ride transit. And so it doesn't reduce automobile sales at all. So they're not going to lobby against it. The people who build highways tend to specialize in things like concrete, and you need a lot of concrete for rail lines, so they're not going to lobby against it. The one group that might be hurt is the asphalt industry. If you build more rail that uses concrete, instead of building roads that use asphalt, you might hurt the asphalt industry a little bit. But they're really the only lobby group that is harmed seriously by rail transit. Now, the taxpayers, as you say, are harmed. I think transit riders are harmed. I think all transportation users are harmed. But these harms are so small per person that very few people are going to spend a lot of their time lobbying against rail transit, whereas so much money can be made when you spend hundreds of millions of dollars a kilometer building rail transit, that all of the engineering and construction and rail car manufacturers and other companies involved are going to lobby hard to see that construction take place.
Okay. So is this a classic case where the politicians can kind of get away with these arguably bad decisions because there's all this big money going towards concentrated benefits of a few, and then the cost is kind of spread out over every taxpayer, and they don't really notice it? Is that what's going on?
Yes, and the really sad thing is that the money for lobbying for these projects is coming out of taxpayers' pockets. The transit agencies will take tax dollars, use it to hire an engineering firm to plan a system and supposedly do an alternatives analysis. But that engineering firm will use some of that money to lobby for that system to be built. And then
Is it?
once they build it, there's more money spread around. And if a measure ever goes on the ballot, then you see rail car manufacturers and construction firms and consulting firms all donating heavily to the ballot measure. If it doesn't
It,
go on the ballot, and they're donating heavily to the political campaigns of the politicians who are favoring this. I know one case where a rail car manufacturer donated a lot of money to a campaign, and as soon as the campaign was over, the transit agency gave that manufacturer the largest light rail contract in history for new light rail cars with no bids, no competitors.
wow.
Just gave this one company without any competition a huge contract to buy light rail cars.
Well, what is your hope in tabling this report as we get the word out about the challenges of rail transit? What are you hoping will come out of this, Randal?
Well, almost all of the 8 cities that are described in the reports are planning more rail lines right now. They're
That's it.
planning extensions of existing lines, brand new lines, or whatever. Sometimes they're planning new technologies, like Toronto has subways, but they're planning more light rail, and so on and so forth. And I'm hoping people will take a look at the report and say, wait a minute, this really doesn't make any sense.
That's it.
These transit agencies should be planning buses, not trains, and they should be redesigning their bus system so that they're serving people who work in places other than just downtown. If our tax dollars
Exactly.
are going for
Yeah.
this, they should be serving all the people in the urban area, not just the 10% who work downtown.
Exactly. So let's hope this is a wake-up call to decision makers and also citizens, because this is a very important issue. When you look at the livability of our cities, our quality of life, our ability to move around and get to work, and to be able to have a life, because you don't want to be just commuting endlessly. Um, these are very important issues. And so, this report I just think is so valuable. To my knowledge, very few have done this kind of analysis in Canada. What did you find your biggest challenge doing this report in the Canadian context? Because you've looked at many systems in parts of the United States and elsewhere.
Yes, and the big problem in Canada was the lack of data.
The
In the
lack
United
of
States,
data.
the lack of data. In the United States,
Yeah,
we have a federal agency, the Federal Transit Administration, that hands out federal dollars to transit agencies. But in
that's
exchange,
it.
the agencies all have to report all kinds of data that the Federal Transit Administration publishes every year. So we know how many people are riding these systems, how much they
That's it.
cost to
That's
build,
it.
how much they cost to operate, and so on and so forth. We know how much energy they use, how many greenhouse gases they
That's it.
emit, what the average number of passengers riding them are, all kinds of stuff. These data are practically non-existent for Canadian systems, and it's partly because
Sorry, not
you're
almost non-existent in the Canadian
almost
context.
non-existent. Yeah,
Wow. Now, keep in mind that Canada has a different federal system. We're more decentralized. We're more
exactly.
powers at certainly the provincial level. Um, but you're saying that even at the provincial level, they don't like they're the parties, the provincial taxpayers, largely funding these projects. They don't really require the data, even though we're spending billions of dollars. That's absurd.
That nobody seems to be asking the questions. Like the most important question to me is, are you getting more transit riders with your current strategy? And just as an
Yeah,
example, Calgary built light rail and transit ridership went up after they opened their light rail line, and that sounds great. But I looked
that's
at the
it.
data more carefully and I discovered transit ridership was rising before they built the light rail. And after they opened the light rail, it grew slower than before they built the light rail. So
Wow.
those are the kinds of questions that funders need to look at, and yet we just give them a pass. We think transit is necessary, transit is vital. You yourself said that, and I'm not even convinced of that outside of New York City and maybe Toronto and
That's it.
Montreal, but nowhere else in Canada. Transit is not that vital, and nobody seems to be questioning assertions about how it is environmentally friendly or that it helps poor people.
That's it.
Nobody questions these things at all.
Yeah. Well, I'm so glad that this report does question those things, and we need to look at these things critically. And so, if we look just beyond the immediate report around transit, specifically rail, I do want to ask you more about comparing and enabling what's called the automobile or even the bicycle. I'm a big fan of those things. And it strikes me that often the automobile is so vigorously vilified when in fact that's a pretty darn good option because you have flexibility, it's quite efficient. Or is it? What's your take on the automobile today, enabling people to get a job and move up the social ladder, Randall?
Well, several studies have shown that if you want to help poor people out of poverty, giving them a free transit pass won't do it. Giving them access to a cheap automobile is really key because in a car, in a typical urban area, you can reach far more jobs in a 20-minute trip, a 30-minute trip, or whatever by automobile than you can by transit. And in fact,
Sorry, can
transit
you
is
repeat that
so
again?
poor.
Can you repeat that
In a
again, Randall?
Yes, in a given length of trip, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and these data are from the University of Minnesota Accessibility Observatory. It would be access.mn.edu, I think, or maybe it's
Okay.
umn.edu. Uh, their data show that typical urban area, you can reach far more jobs in a trip of any given length, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 40, 50, 60 minutes, by car than by transit. And you can reach like 3 times as many jobs in a 20-minute car trip than in a 60-minute transit trip. And
Wow.
transit is so slow and inefficient that a bicycle rider in reasonably good condition, not a pro cycle racer or anything like that, but just somebody who's reasonably fit, can reach more jobs on a bicycle in trips of 50 minutes or less than by urban transit. Uh, and that's partly because transit is so downtown oriented. So if you're going to a
Yeah.
job that's downtown, you can get there faster than on a bicycle. But if you're going to a job anywhere else, a bicycle will get you there faster.
Okay. Well, that's fascinating. So cars are very important. Um, and when we look at the transit landscape as well, bicycles are also important. Yet it's fascinating within Canada, it's pretty trendy for communities of all sizes to introduce bicycle lanes. Some are even um, uh, dedicated areas of the highway. They even have concrete barriers that create these bicycle lanes. And I will tell you the truth, as much as I'm enthusiastic about bicycles, it's incredible how in so many cases I don't see hardly any bicycles using these bicycle lanes. And yet a lot of money seems to be spent on creating these dedicated areas and kind of squeezing out the automobile and even making it more difficult for, say, things like buses, let alone people that are commuting and trying to make deliveries. Does that make sense to be making all these dedicated bicycle lanes everywhere we're turning these days, Randall?
Well, what I see is that these lanes are less bicycle friendly than that they are auto hostile. If you take say a 4-lane street and take away one of the lanes, you have a one lane in each direction and a center left turn lane, and then you turn that extra lane into a bike lane, one in each direction.
Hey,
You think, well, you're making bicycling safer because that'll help prevent the bicyclist from being hit from behind by a car. The problem is that most bicycle accidents don't involve the car hitting the bicycle from behind. Most bicycle accidents are at intersections where the
really?
lanes disappear. So there are no bike lanes at the intersections. That's where most bicycle accidents happen. And you haven't solved that problem. A
Is
much
it?
better way of doing it would be to find an alternate route for the bicycles They're sometimes called bicycle boulevards. You find a local street that is used only for local traffic by cars and turn
That's
it
it.
into a through street for bicycles, but put in a few concrete barriers here and there to still allow local access by cars, but not through
That's it.
access.
That's
Then
it.
you take away the stop signs that bicyclists might otherwise have to face if they were on that street, and you've got a fast throughway for the bicycles that is much safer for the cyclist than putting them on a busy street with no protection at the intersections.
Hey, that seems to make a lot of sense. I mean, I think part of the frustration I hear from all kinds of people in Canada is that it's great to promote bicycling, but what's the balance here, especially given the reality of what's called winter. Winter happens in Canada, and for much of this season, people don't bicycle. Now there are some rabid enthusiasts that do. I get it, but the point is that realistically, the numbers are very, very tiny, and so this is where have are we really again um, finding any data and evaluation whether all this stuff, these kinds of strategies are working. I have yet to see any kind of traffic count done on the use of these bicycle lanes because I can tell you anecdotally, the numbers are very, very small.
Well, we have excellent data in the United States because the Census Bureau every single year asks 3.5 million households, how do the people living in your household get to work? So we're
Yeah,
able to track bicycling, walking, transit, rail transit, bus transit, driving alone, carpooling, and other modes as well. And so we've got data, we can look at trends. And there was a time back around 1990 that maybe it was around in the early 2000s, the Portland, Oregon had the highest level of bicycle ridership in the country. And they, patted Portland on the back. They said it's because of all the bike lanes you put in and so on and so forth. Well, in the years since then, it's dwindled down to back down to be about the same as anywhere else. So
for
it
sure.
was a fad for a while, but it just isn't as important today as it once was. And it never was very important. It was like 6 or 7% of people were getting
For
to
sure.
work on bicycles versus 70 or 80% by car. So cars are very important. Cars produce all kinds of benefits. They give us access to better housing, lower cost consumer goods, more recreation areas, more social opportunities, as well as more jobs. And no other form of transportation, not bicycling, not transit, not anything, has been able to compete with cars for most urban trips in terms of
That's it.
cost, convenience, and speed.
So, if you had to give advice to decision makers across these 8 Canadian cities that you examined, what in essence would it be, Randall, as we look to the future?
I don't think they need to do any more rail studies. I think the data are
Sure.
in. Rails don't work. They're slow, they're inefficient, they're expensive. And it's time to figure out how do we redesign our bus systems so that they serve people throughout the urban area rather than just people in downtown. And the report that you published, that I wrote, has such a proposal for Calgary. It says, let's identify a lot of urban centers. Calgary has the
Yep.
university, it has the airport, it has a health center in the south part of the urban area. It has some retail centers in the south of downtown. And let's identify those centers and provide bus service to those centers that is as good as the transit service that's now going downtown.
That's it.
And I found that the proposal would require the use of about 240 bus routes. Well, right now, Calgary has almost 270 bus routes, so it might even cost less to have a system that serves all the region instead of just downtown than the current system does today.
Well said. And you can find, again, that report on the Frontier Center for Public Policy website. And you can find that particular proposal that Randal's referring to in that report. So I want to thank you so much, Randal O'Toole, for joining us for this conversation and for your leadership on this very important issue of transit and how it can better serve you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for watching Leaders on the Frontier. We're a nonpartisan think tank. We explore ideas, policy, and practical solutions that can make a difference in the lives of Canadians. We do not accept any government funding. We work for you. Thank you for supporting Frontier. Visit fcpp.org to give. While you're there, be sure to check out our latest articles and research. Without open discussion and debate, you're not thinking, nor are you free. Comment below. We'd love for you to join the conversation.